Hello, my name is Andrew Keane. Welcome to Keane on America, the daily show about everything that matters, with the world's leading commentators and thinkers. Hello everyone, we're back at DLD 2026. The central theme, it seems to me, this year of DLD is the increasing economic division between the United States and Europe, especially on the tech front, but also in terms of economic development and wealth. One man who knows more about this than most is my guest today, Carl. I'm going to start this again, Carl. Hello everyone, we're back at DLD 2026. One of the main themes, it seems, this year, as every year at DLD, is the increasing economic gap between the United States and Europe. One man who has spent an awful lot of time looking at this is my guest today. Carl Benedikt Frey is Swedish-born, teaches in the United Kingdom. He's the author of the acclaimed 2025 book, How Progress Ends, and he is a frequent speaker at DLD. Carl, am I right to suggest that every year at DLD it seems as if this economic gap, particularly when it comes to technology, becomes deeper and deeper between the United States and Europe?
I think that's a fair assessment, and I think more and more people are starting to realize that not just that Europe isn't leading in innovation, but is also failing to catch up in digital. And that's somewhat surprising because it's something that Europe has been historically good at. The continent caught up to Britain, which led the Industrial Revolution in the 18th and 19th centuries. Europe caught up with the United States in mass production during the post-war period, but we haven't really managed to even catch up in digital, and that is a bit of a puzzle.
Why all the hand-wringing, Carl? Why Europeans feel as if they have some sort of God-given right to dominate economics and technology? Perhaps is almost a colonial mentality?
I'm not sure that that's true. In fact, I think much of this concern is a response to Europe feeling increasingly squeezed between China and the United States, in part because China used to be a very significant export market, but China is now pursuing a strategy of self-sufficiency. And so exporting to a country that doesn't want your stuff in the long term is not a sustainable growth model. And Europe has historically relied much on American technology. In the post-war period, there were concerted efforts of technology transfer through Marshall Aid, which was one of the reasons that Europe grew very rapidly in this period. But the United States is now increasingly looking after its own interest. And so that means that Europe needs to start looking after its own interests as well, and cannot no longer rely on either American technology or Chinese export markets, and it needs to find a new growth model.
Carl, this isn't really news, is it, though? It seems, perhaps it's easy for me to say as an outsider, self-evident. Why has it taken so long for Europeans to really confront this? And why have they done so little to actually address this fundamental flaw in their economies in the second quarter of the 21st century?
So I think part of the reason is that changing growth models is hard. If it was easy, the entire world would be rich and prosperous. And so during the post-war period, Europe was very good at absorbing American mass production technology and implementing it across a range of industries. But around the 1970s, the second industrial revolution petered out, productivity slowed around the world, something new was needed for growth. That new thing was the computer revolution, and the United States was more dynamic in digital, in part because it pursued vigorous competition policy. Lawsuits against IBM opened up the market for Microsoft. Lawsuits against Microsoft opened up the market for Google, and the breakup of AT&T was very significant for the following revolution in e-commerce. And so the United States surged ahead of Europe in digital, and because Europe doesn't really have the same degree of dynamism, if you look at the top 5 firms in Europe by market capitalization, whether you look to France or Germany or Spain or Italy, they're over 100 years old on average. In the United States, they are less than 40 years old, and they're all in tech. And I think with recent geopolitical concerns around political developments in the US and China, this has now moved to the forefront of European policy making, or policy concern at least, I should say.
To what extent is this failure an indictment of the technocratic model in the EU of governance?
Well, I think coordinated capitalism in Europe ran into diminishing returns already in the 1970s. And, it's hard to change institutions, Banks are very important to industrial development in Europe. They have developed strong relationships with industrial conglomerates over many decades. And, banks are good at funding infrastructure projects which provide tangible goods, that provide ample collateral, but it's because it relies on relationships and because it requires collateral, it's not that suitable for funding innovation and the next generation of firms. And more decentralized American capital markets have been better capable of doing that.
The American model, as you note, of a purer, more of a free market capitalism offers one alternative, of course. But to what extent, Carl, does the Chinese top-down authoritarian model offer an alternative to Europe?
So if Europe wanted to do Chinese-style industrial policy, it would first have to create a one-party system in Europe. And then it could turn Merz and Macron and Sanchez and others into provincial governors, and then have them compete within the party system for positions by meeting growth targets and trying to foster industrial development. And as listeners will probably have realized, that's not going to happen in Europe, nor would it be desirable. But I think it's an important point because few people realize how fiercely competitive Chinese industrial policy has been. It's not a question of a few technocrats in Beijing selecting key industries. Up until recently, at least, Chinese growth since the grand opening has very much been driven by local governments competing against each other. And this was not by design. Back in the 80s, Beijing and surrounding areas pursued more top-down industrial policy, whereas the South opened up to global supply chains. And Dong then saw firsthand during his southern tour in 1992 that the South was prospering and firms were moving down from the northern parts of China to the South to actually integrate into global supply chains, and that surprised him. And to his credit, though, he realized the benefits of these special economic zones, and that was key to China's success. But that model is very hard to replicate, not to say impossible, and so I don't think Europe can actually learn that much by looking at Chinese industrial policy, at least for its own purposes.
Do you see any genuinely innovative thinking when it comes to revitalizing, remaking the European economy, perhaps from the radical populist right? It doesn't seem to be coming from the left.
Well, I think there is a realization that Europe doesn't really have a single market in services. And so the IMF estimates that if you take all barriers to trade in services in Europe and you add them up, they amount to something like the 110% tariff. So Trump Liberation Day tariffs, self-imposed inside the European Union. And I think that's also one of the reasons why we don't see large-scale digital service companies in the European Union, while you see them in the United States and China. And so I think there's a genuine need for harmonizing the single market. That doesn't sound like, a very appealing populist policy to run a campaign on, but it's very necessary. Unfortunately, though, there's not been that much happening in way of harmonization, but realization is the first step, and at least we're there now.
Is it game over, Carl, for Europe? I mean, is there any way back, especially given the global duopoly, it seems, of American and Chinese tech companies?
Europe has the largest single market for goods in the world. It can also have the largest single market for services in the world. It's a matter of political will. It's a matter of overriding certain vested interests that are making reform difficult. So it's certainly not game over. There is a lot to play for. There are things that are tangible that can be done, but of course, if it was easy, it would have been done already.
So where's the resistance coming from? It seems self-evident, for Europeans at least, that they would want the politics to generate more wealth, more competitiveness in the global economy. It would also result in more political power. Where is the key resistance to what you call this political will? Is it inertia? Is it conservatism? Is it the old left, the new left?
Well, I think you mentioned several interest groups that are relevant here. I would add that you often have local or national business interests that are pushing for different interpretations of European directives, which means that you have different rules and regulations and different exemptions in parts of Europe, and that is really what's leading to this fragmentation of the single market. So it's national business interests which are often not that keen on being exposed to competition from abroad.
Does it really matter ultimately though, Carl? It matters, of course, for economic theorists and historians like yourself, but as you know, Europe has the largest market. It's still a relatively prosperous continent, especially compared to Africa. Can Europe maintain its reasonably high standard of living, its welfare state democracy, whilst China and the United States surges ahead, further ahead on the tech front, especially with AI?
I think Europe needs a general will to make growth a priority. And you can ask yourself, of course, why does growth matter? But the truth is, if you look at service where people report their life satisfaction, and you correlate that with income across countries, the correlation is very, very strong. People are also, voting with their feet every day, and they're moving to places where incomes are higher, not lower. And more fundamentally, an economy that is not growing eventually becomes a zero-sum game where the only way for me to improve my standard of living is at the expense of somebody else. And obviously, such zero-sum thinking, competition for resources, lead to political tensions of the kind that we're seeing right now.
Are there historical analogies then to this decline in Europe? Might we look to China or India in the context of the rise of the West 300-400 years ago?
Well, of course, Europe was a backwater up until around 1500. China was leading the way in technology and prosperity around the world, with obviously by the standards of the day. But since 1500, and certainly from the Industrial Revolution, Europe has been in the driver's seat. America overtook, to be sure, Europe technologically around 1900, but Europe grew very rapidly during the post-war period, as I mentioned earlier, benefiting from American technology. And so Europe is, in recent memory, in uncharted territory, needing to catch up, but not showing the same capacity to do so as it did by catching up to Britain in the 19th century or the United States in the post-war period.
So what becomes of the strengths of the European economy? Tourism, for example, car manufacturing in Germany, luxury goods in France or Italy. Can they survive and prosper in a Europe which is increasingly a broader economic backwater?
Well, certainly European tourism and luxury industries are not just dependent on the fortunes of Europeans, and they're already becoming increasingly dependent on foreign incomes. But Europe is not going to maintain its current levels of income by doubling down on tourism and luxury goods. So we need new industries. New industries means attracting talent to Europe, and part of the reason why talent has moved to the US in the first hand is that American universities are better funded, and so people generally have more opportunity in research in the United States. They have if you're an entrepreneur, you have a large market that you can scale into. Marginal tax rates are lower in Europe, and so something you saw when the Soviet Union collapsed. They had a lot of talent. Where did that talent move? To places where marginal tax rates were generally lower. And so those are some of the things that Europe need to think about.
Carl, you've said that it's not game over yet for Europe, so presumably you think there are scenarios where Europe can get its economic mojo back. Is this more likely to happen within the EU or after some sort of fragmentation of the European Union?
I think it's quite unlikely to happen after some kind of fragmentation. And so, what Europe needs is a harmonized single market. That single market is not going to emerge out of a politically fragmented Europe. And so I think we need to work with the institutions that we have in place and improve them, and not be satisfied with the status quo, but also not going in with a sledgehammer and destroying everything that we have built.
Isn't it, though, more dependent on political leadership than institutions? This innovation certainly is not going to come from Brussels, and it's not going to come from large bureaucracies. Doesn't it require a new kind of political leader, a Bismarck, a European Bismarck for the 21st century?
Well, with 27 member states, you do need to reach agreements, and I think the situation that Europe is now in, with China becoming more inward-looking, with the United States becoming more inward-looking, I think that means that there is a sense in Europe that something needs to happen. And so I think that crisis, if you like, is a genuine opportunity, and we need to take it.
But you keep on saying, Carl, that there's a realization that stuff needs to happen. But there's been that realization for decades, ever since certainly the beginning of the 21st century. It hasn't happened yet. I know I keep on asking the same question, but why should you be optimistic that it will happen now?
I think the realization that China is aiming for self-sufficiency and that Chinese markets are gradually becoming less critical export markets for Europe is a relatively recent one. And the unreliability of the United States as a partner is certainly a very recent realization. And so, it's only been, it has just about been a year since the inauguration of the second Trump administration. And so that is not a very long time in political terms, and I think that's some reason for cautious optimism.
To end, Carl, I'm going to make you, at least for the purposes of this interview, President of Europe. You have, if not dictatorial power, certainly substantial power. That you can make things happen. What has to change? What would you do if Carl Benedikt Frey became President of Europe for a day or two, and you could create the conditions for economic reform and dynamism?
Well, first of all, I would decline the invitation, as any Democrat should. But I keep coming back to the same question. What Europe needs to do is to create conditions for businesses to scale. What Europe needs to do is to make it less costly for entrepreneurs to set up and innovate. And if you do those two things, you already come a long way. So I would accept the invitation to advise along those lines, but that's about as far as I go.
Are there other models though? Korea, Japan, China, Singapore?
I think you're pointing to something quite important there, and the way Europe grew during the post-war period was not very different from the way that Korea or Japan surged ahead during the post-war period. And some people are arguing that we should do Airbus for AI, and by all means Airbus was a very successful attempt to create a peer competitor to Boeing. But there were also numerous attempts in Europe to create national semiconductor industries which failed dismally. And so what's the difference? I think a key difference is that aircraft technology was fairly mature by the time Airbus set up. The jet engine had already been developed over a decade ago. And so Europe was catching up to a static target. Semiconductors, progress was very rapid, and so you were chasing a moving target. And that's even more true with artificial intelligence today, right? And so we don't know if the future of AI is large language models, is it small language models, is it symbolic AI, is it some fusion between them, is there something else? So it's very hard to pursue the European, Korean, Japan style catch-up growth in frontier technologies like AI for that reason.
Well, Carl Benedikt Frey, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate your generosity. I'm guessing, though, that when I see you next year, we will have the same conversation. What do you think?
I admit there's a risk.